السلام عليكم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا ونبينا وحبيبنا محمدا وعلى آله وأصحابه ومن والاه ثم ما بعد. First of all, for all of those of you who are watching, inshallah, God willing, everything is going well for you, and may you be benefiting from Black History Month. I just want to make some brief comments to the HOTEPpers, Black Orientalists, and to the Islam critics, primarily the white Islam critics, regarding the Arab slave trade, and how there are people every year during Black History Month who come forth to Muslims, especially people who are black, and say, oh well, you know, you're talking about what happened with the transatlantic slave trade, but what about the Arab slave trade? So the first point, the number one point, and there's 3 points I want to make. So the first point is this whole point about Arabness and blackness being mutually exclusive in the minds of many people. So the number one point, or the first point in relationship to this, is in which we talk about in our new book from Sidi Ahmed Mubarak and myself about centering black narrative, black Muslim nobles amongst the early pious Muslims, that blackness as a racial construct now and how we view blackness now is not how blackness was looked at 1,000 years ago, 1,400 years ago, for instance. So when we look at old texts relating to Arabs and their physical descriptions, many Arabs themselves would be seen as black people today 1,400 years ago. And of course, this is several reasons. One, look at the geographical area of Arabs. The mother of the Arabs, actually, Hagar or Hajar, was a black Ethiopian woman. But then also, too, that Ethiopia, in the year of the elephant, this is chronicled in the Quran, was turned back away from invading the area of Mecca. But prior to this area, Ethiopians had conquered Yemen. So, I mean, obviously, when a group of people get conquered, as Ethiopians or Africans conquered Arabs, they have relations with women. They also conquered their women. So there are Arabs themselves who were conquered by Ethiopians and thus had African blood within themselves. So this is just something that's historical fact, and there are prominent Muslims or prominent Arabs in the first generation, such as Umar ibn al-Khattab, who had Ethiopian lineage. This is known as a fact. Even in the Arab slave trade, when you look at two of the most prolific traders, and the Arabs who were involved in the Arab slave trade in East Africa came from Yemen and Oman, you would see, for those who can read Arabic and look at some old texts, that actually two of the most notorious slave traders were described as being black or blacker than many of the people they enslaved as far as their melanin. This is number one. Number two is that slavery at that time, if we go back, was a universal system. It was something that was done worldwide. It was something that was done prior to the transatlantic slave trade. Europeans enslaved Europeans. Arabs enslaved other Arabs. They enslaved Persians. They enslaved African people. Africans enslaved other Africans. Africans at one time had enslaved Arabs. So when we look at this, it was a universal system. What differentiates the Arab in terms of how they were enslaving people or had people enslaved, just as African tribes, is that they would fight a group of people, they would capture them, and then they would become slaves. But it was not something that was based solely on phenotype or a racial background, as this transatlantic slave trade ended up being. Then I would also make the third point, is that the slavery that the Arabs were involved in was quite different from Western Europeans in this very important point. Western Europeans and child slavery here in the United States of America, or we can look down at the Caribbean, South America. When Europeans enslaved people and they sired children from slave women, then those children stayed as slaves and they were relegated to a permanent underclass. However, amongst the Arabs who were Muslim, when they sired a child from a woman that had been enslaved, there were two different things that happened. The first thing is that the woman was automatically freed from bondage, number one. The second thing is that the child was born free and took on the lineage and the societal privilege of the father. Hence, you have several stories amongst the Arabs when they came to Islam that actually a boy who was born from a slave mother would end up rising and be the emir, to be the prince, or be actually the leader amongst the Muslims who was born from a mother who had been enslaved. So this is a completely different paradigm from Western Europeans and the transatlantic slave trade, and this is also well documented in Islamic history. But some of this is hidden from the HOTEPpers, in particular the Black Orientalists, is that they primarily focus on texts that are written in the English language or written in French. So their basic frame of reference is textual evidence that has been written by Europeans, which is actually the irony of the situation of people who are supposed to be so pro-black and so back to Africa that they're not reading text about the history of Africa that is written in Hausa or written in Fulani or Arabic or Kiswahili. Their primary form of reference of when they discuss African civilization from Kemit to South Africa is texts that are written in European languages. So with that, I will stop. We're going to write something longer about this subject in terms of the Arab, the so-called Arab slave trade in East Africa, and to try to give more historical facts and proofs relating to this and how it was different from child slavery in West Africa. This is by no means to say that Arabs were racism free or that Arabs are racism free today. Anti-blackness has crept up into Arabs, and there is racism to this very day in the Arab world. But it is to say that it's a very sloppy comparison and not really well thought out to try to compare what Arab Muslims did in terms of slavery and how they dealt with the enslaved and liberated the slaves or enslaved people in comparison to the system of white supremacy that brought about the transatlantic slave trade and the enslavement of African people here in the United States of America for over 3 centuries. It is completely different, and those who make those comparisons make extremely sloppy comparisons. So we're going to be writing that, inshallah, and again also go out and buy our new book centering Black narrative, Black Muslim nobles amongst the early pious Muslims, and we go back to classical texts and elucidate or show that Arabness and blackness in the classical period, going back 1400 years ago, Islamic history, and before as well as shortly after, that black skin and dark brown skin was the predominant feature, or what Arabs were predominantly recognized as being not whiteness, and that this whole issue of somehow Arabness and blackness being mutually exclusive, that we completely knocked that out the park in our book, and the book is very well referenced. So please go out and get the book. It's on Center Space, spaces.com, as well as Amazon.com. Peace be upon you. Assalamu alaikum.